The champagne hit me before I even saw his arm move. Cold. Sharp. Expensive. It splashed across my collarbone and soaked into the silk of my white gown, sliding down in sticky streams while the ballroom went silent around us. The string quartet faltered mid-note. A glass shattered somewhere near the back. I could smell citrus and yeast and humiliation. Richard was still smiling. He stood there in his tailored tuxedo, holding the empty flute as if this were part of the evening's entertainment. Then he leaned toward the microphone and said lightly, "Sometimes my wife gets a little passionate about numbers." A few uneasy laughs scattered through the crowd. Investors. Donors. Board members. Reporters. My husband had just thrown champagne on me in the middle of our annual gala, and he believed the embarrassment would make me bow my head and protect his reputation. He thought I would shrink. What he didn't realize was that I still had the final toast. The Veterans Renewal Foundation Gala was the most important night of our year. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom of the Crescent Hotel in Dallas. Crystal chandeliers glowed above round tables dressed in navy linen. At the front of the room, a silent auction display shimmered under spotlights. This wasn't just charity. It was visibility, donor trust, investor confidence. Our brand. Richard Cole, founder of a rising private equity firm and my husband of 8 years, was the face of disciplined leadership. The CEO who turned distressed assets into success stories. The visionary preparing his company for an IPO next year. And I was introduced as co-founder of the foundation. The compassionate half of the partnership. The woman who told the stories while he handled the strategy. At least, that was the image we sold. I didn't wipe the champagne from my skin. I let it cling there, cool and obvious. Across the room, I saw Margaret Holloway, our largest donor, staring at me with narrowed eyes. Not pity. Assessment. 3 hours earlier, I had been alone in my office reviewing pledge sheets when a discreet email notification appeared on my screen. Please review attached before tonight. It was from Daniel Ruiz, one of our junior accountants. Young. Meticulous. Nervous. The spreadsheet he sent was clean on the surface. Consulting payments. Advisory fees. Strategic facilitation costs. But one column didn't align with the board-approved allocations. The payments were routed through a limited liability company I didn't recognize. Until I did. The LLC traced back to Richard's younger brother. The same brother whose last development project had collapsed under debt. At first glance, nothing was criminal. Just convenient? But charitable funds moving toward related parties without full disclosure to the board, that wasn't just poor optics. That was financial misconduct waiting to be exposed. I had felt the betrayal settle in my chest like a stone. Not because of the money. Because of the deception. Backstage. Before the speeches began, I approached Richard quietly. The ballroom buzzed beyond the curtains. Waitstaff adjusted place settings. The band tuned instruments. I saw the consulting allocations. I said softly. He didn't flinch. He adjusted his cufflinks instead. "It's temporary," he replied. "Bridge capital until the next quarter closes. You didn't disclose it to the full board." His jaw tightened. "Naomi, tonight is not the time." Then when... He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Think about what you're doing. The IPO. The investors in that room. Don't embarrass us." Us. That word used to mean partnership. Lately, it meant silence. I watched him straighten my necklace like I was a prop. Not a co-founder. He kissed my cheek for the photographers and walked toward the stage. That was the moment I understood something clearly. This wasn't about a temporary reallocation. It was about control. He believed I would protect the image. Protect the brand. Protect him. Now, standing in that ballroom with champagne dripping from my dress, I saw that belief written across his face. He thought humiliation would reset the balance of power. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat awkwardly. "And now, please welcome Naomi Carter for the final toast of the evening." A ripple moved through the crowd. Richard stepped back. Confident again, certain I would apologize. Or smooth things over. Or pretend nothing had happened. I felt the weight of every eye on me. Shame tried to rise first, then anger. But what settled instead was something steadier. If I stayed silent, I would become complicit. Not just in his behavior, but in the hidden truth behind those spreadsheets. I walked toward the stage in the champagne-stained gown. My heels clicked against the polished floor. No one laughed now. Richard gave me a warning look. Subtle, controlled. The kind that said we would discuss this later. I didn't look away. As I reached the podium, I saw Daniel near the back of the room, watching anxiously. I saw Margaret Holloway leaning forward in her chair. I saw members of the board whispering to one another. The microphone waited. Richard thought I would lower my head. Instead, I reached for it. I didn't wipe the champagne from my dress when I began to speak. My husband and I founded this organization on one belief, I said, my voice steady through the microphone. That honor does not end when service does. The ballroom was still too quiet. People weren't sure if they were allowed to clap. I didn't look at Richard. Instead, I looked at the veterans seated near the front tables. Men with straight backs and quiet eyes. Women who had rebuilt their lives with help from our housing grants and employment programs. Every dollar given tonight, I continued, represents trust, not just generosity. Trust. I saw the shift begin. Donors sat up straighter. Board members exchanged cautious glances. Trust? That word had weight. I hadn't lost power overnight. It had been taken inch by inch. When Richard and I first built the Veterans Renewal Foundation, we sat at our kitchen table with legal pads and coffee cups, drafting mission statements side by side. We debated strategy. We reviewed numbers together. We believed in the same cause. Somewhere along the way, the meetings moved without me. Financial approvals shifted into private sessions with the CFO. Advisory committees were formed that I wasn't invited to join. When I asked questions, Richard would smile and say, "Let me handle the complex numbers. You're better with people." It sounded like praise. It was containment. 3 hours before the gala, when Daniel's email landed in my inbox, that containment cracked. The spreadsheet was precise. Repeated consulting payments routed through an entity that had no visible public presence. When I traced the registration records, I found the name of Richard's brother listed quietly as managing member. The payments weren't small. They weren't accidental rounding errors. They were deliberate. Not yet illegal, but ethically dangerous. I could have confronted Richard more aggressively. I could have demanded answers before the ballroom filled with donors and investors. I waited, because part of me wanted to see if he would choose transparency on his own. Back at the podium, I let the silence stretch just long enough to command attention. Transparency, I said carefully, isn't just a policy. It's a discipline. I heard someone shift in their chair. When we ask our donors to believe in us, we owe them clarity. When we ask veterans to trust us with their futures, we owe them accountability. Richard's smile tightened. Some people in that room already knew what I was referring to. The board chair had received my brief message earlier that afternoon, requesting a governance discussion after the event. Daniel had copied limited documentation into a secure folder. The CFO had gone unusually quiet. I wasn't the only one aware. If there are ever questions, I continued, about how funds are allocated, about consulting relationships, about oversight, it is our duty to examine them openly. A ripple passed through the crowd. Consulting relationships. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone by name. I elevated the standard instead. Richard shifted his weight slightly behind me. From the corner of my eye, I could see him calculating optics. He had warned me backstage. Think about the IPO. Think about what this does to us. He believed my loyalty to our shared wealth would override my moral line. He miscalculated what mattered to me. Tonight, I said, my fingers steady around the microphone, I am formally recommending that our foundation engage an independent external review of our financial governance, effective immediately. Gasps weren't loud. They were subtle, controlled, the kind that happen when sophisticated people recognize risk. Independent, external, review. The board members at the front table went very still. If they rejected my proposal publicly, they would look complicit. If they supported it, they would be endorsing scrutiny. I turned slightly toward them. I trust our board of directors will stand with me in reaffirming our commitment to full transparency. There it was, the pivot. I watched the board chair's expression change from confusion to awareness. He nodded once, slowly. Margaret Holloway began clapping first. It wasn't enthusiastic at first. It was deliberate. Then others followed. The sound grew. Richard clapped too. Controlled. Polished. His jaw tight. He had built his empire on perception. On controlling rooms. On anticipating reactions. He hadn't anticipated this one. As the applause continued, I felt something inside me settle into place. Humiliation had been his strategy. Accountability was mine. I wasn't attacking him. I wasn't unraveling our life in a fit of anger. I was choosing governance over silence. And that difference mattered. My phone vibrated faintly in the small clutch at my side. I didn't look at it yet, but I knew who it was. Daniel. When the applause finally softened, I lifted the microphone one last time. Honor isn't only worn on a uniform, I said. It's practiced in boardrooms. And we will practice it. I stepped away from the podium without looking back. As I descended the stage steps, my phone buzzed again. This time I glanced down. CFO just tried to access archived files. Across the room, I saw the board chair lean toward Richard urgently. Reporters near the entrance were already whispering. The toast was over. The investigation had just begun. The applause followed me off the stage. But it didn't feel celebratory. It felt decisive. By the time I reached the edge of the ballroom, the board chair, Thomas Whitaker, was already at Richard's side. Their heads bent close together, voices low, expressions carefully neutral for anyone watching. My phone buzzed again in my hand. CFO is in his office. IT says he requested archive access authorization override. Daniel's messages were coming faster now. I stepped into a quieter hallway near the restrooms. The distant hum of the Gala muffled behind thick carpeted walls. For a brief second, the silence pressed in around me. Then Richard appeared. "You've made your point," he said, his voice calm but tight. There was no need to blindside the board. I didn't blindside anyone, I replied. I recommended transparency. You suggested misconduct in front of donors. I suggested accountability. His eyes hardened. You're reacting emotionally. There it was again. The same dismissal he had used for years. Emotional. Passionate. Impulsive. I held his gaze. If there's nothing to hide, an independent review will confirm it. He studied me carefully, as if trying to determine how far I was willing to go. You're risking everything, he said quietly. The IPO. Investor confidence. Our reputation. Our reputation. I thought of the spreadsheet. Of consulting payments routed quietly through an entity controlled by his brother. Of board members who had never been told. Reputation without integrity doesn't hold, I said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Thomas stepped into the hallway. Richard, he said evenly, we need a few minutes in the conference room. Richard glanced at me once more before walking away with him. I returned to the ballroom briefly, offering composed smiles to donors who approached with cautious praise. Margaret Holloway squeezed my hand. You did the right thing, she murmured. Transparency protects everyone. I nodded, aware that protection now came at a cost. Within 30 minutes, the executive board was gathered in a small conference room adjacent to the ballroom. The music and laughter from the gala filtered faintly through the walls, a strange contrast to the tension inside. I took a seat at the long mahogany table opposite Richard. Thomas cleared his throat. Naomi has formally recommended an independent external audit of Foundation financial governance. The CFO shifted in his chair. This is unnecessary escalation, he said quickly. There are explanations for the consulting allocations. Then provide them, I said. He glanced at Richard before answering. The payments were strategic advisory transfers. Were they disclosed as related party transactions to the full board? I asked. Silence. Thomas looked between us. Were they? The CFO hesitated. Not in that specific terminology. Why not? I pressed. Richard leaned forward. Because there was no intent to conceal anything. We were managing liquidity ahead of larger capital events. Larger capital events. The IPO. Thomas's expression tightened. Were any of these entities connected to executive family members? The room grew still. That's irrelevant, Richard said. It's not irrelevant, I replied. It's governance. Thomas folded his hands. We will proceed with an independent audit. Effective immediately. All financial records are to be preserved. I felt Daniel's earlier text echo in my mind. Preserved? I repeated quietly. The CFO swallowed. After the meeting adjourned, the hallway felt colder. Guests were leaving. Valets moved briskly outside. A few reporters lingered near the entrance. Scanning faces, one approached me cautiously. Mrs. Cole, can you comment on the independent review? It's about reinforcing transparency, I said. Nothing more. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Richard speaking sharply into his phone. When we finally returned home that night, the Dallas skyline glowed beyond our windows. The house felt cavernous, too large for the silence between us. Richard poured himself a drink without offering me one. You've handed ammunition to regulators, he said flatly. If everything is clean, there's nothing to fear. You don't understand how these things work. I faced him. Then help me understand. He set the glass down harder than necessary. This wasn't just about consulting fees. Timing matters. Structure matters. And disclosure matters. He exhaled sharply. You chose donors over your own husband tonight. I felt the weight of that accusation settle between us. No, I said quietly. I chose integrity over silence. His expression shifted, not rage. Not yet. Something colder. Be careful, he said. If this spirals, it won't just be my career affected. The implication hung there. Legal exposure. Shared leadership. Shared responsibility. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder how deep the structure went. My phone vibrated again. Preliminary audit engagement letter signed. They start in 48 hours. I looked up at Richard, who was already staring back at me. The toast had shifted the room. But this was only the beginning. The real damage hadn't started yet. The official engagement letter from the audit firm arrived before sunrise. I was already awake. Sleep had come in fragments, broken by the memory of champagne soaking into silk and Richard's voice telling me to be careful. When the email notification lit up my phone, the language was sterile and precise. Independent forensic review of governance and related party transactions. There it was. Real. Institutional. No longer a disagreement between husband and wife. Downstairs. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of early traffic on the highway. Richard stood at the kitchen counter in his workout clothes, scrolling through financial news on his tablet. They're moving quickly, he said without looking up. So are the regulators, I replied. He set the tablet down slowly. You've made this bigger than it needed to be. It was already big. He let out a short breath through his nose. This is procedural. These reviews happen all the time. Then you have nothing to worry about. He looked at me then, not angry, measuring. What exactly are you implying? He asked. I'm implying that if there were related party transactions that weren't fully disclosed, that's a problem. His jaw tightened. You're speaking like an attorney. Maybe someone has to. By mid-morning, the board had called an emergency meeting. The atmosphere in the conference room felt different from the night of the gala. Less shock, more calculation. Our legal counsel joined via video conference. The audit firm's lead partner outlined the initial scope. Document preservation, email archives, transaction tracing, interviews with executive leadership. When she mentioned digital preservation, the CFO shifted visibly in his seat. We've already secured internal records, he said quickly. The auditor's voice remained calm. We will require full server access to confirm completeness. Completeness. I thought of Daniel's text about attempted archive access override. Thomas Whitaker leaned forward. No deletions. No alterations. Is that understood? Richard answered before anyone else. Of course. But his voice was thinner than usual. As the meeting adjourned, I stepped into the hallway to call Daniel. They're preserving everything. I told him. Good, he said quietly. Because some folders were flagged for removal late Saturday night. By whom? He hesitated. Authorization came from executive credentials. Executive credentials. I didn't need him to finish the sentence. That afternoon, another layer surfaced. The audit firm requested documentation tying certain consulting entities to our foundation disclosures. One of those entities overlapped with a private equity advisory network connected to Richard's firm. It wasn't just a charity question anymore. It was an IPO question. In a follow-up meeting, legal counsel spoke carefully. If related party transactions were not fully disclosed in offering documents, regulators may view that as material. Material. The word landed heavier than champagne. Richard leaned back in his chair. You're speculating. We're assessing exposure. Counsel corrected. I watched as the room shifted around him. The same board members who once deferred to his confidence were now studying him cautiously. For years, he had controlled perception. Now perception was controlling him. By early evening, the first media inquiry arrived. A reporter from the Dallas Business Chronicle requested comment regarding governance questions tied to the foundation and potential IPO implications. The story hadn't broken yet, but it was circling. Who leaked this? Richard demanded. No one leaked anything, I said. We announced an independent review publicly. He stared at me. You knew what that would trigger. Yes, I said evenly. Transparency. Back home. The air felt charged. Richard poured another drink. His movements were sharper now. Do you understand what happens if this reaches federal-level scrutiny? He asked. I understand that hiding things makes it worse. He laughed once. Humorless. You think this is about hiding. This is about structure. Timing. Strategy. If strategy requires silence about conflicts of interest, it's flawed. His eyes flashed. You're risking not just my career. Yours. I held his gaze. If there was nothing improper, the audit will confirm it. And if there was... The question hung between us. Before I could answer, my phone rang. Thomas. I stepped into the hallway. We're proceeding with full digital preservation and expanding the scope to include private equity overlap, he said quietly. Counsel advises voluntary notification to federal regulators if material inconsistencies appear. Federal regulators. When I returned to the living room, Richard was watching me. Was that about federal disclosure? He asked. Yes. For the first time since the Gala, I saw something other than anger in his face. Fear. They're expanding the scope, he said slowly. I nodded. The champagne stain had washed out of my dress. But now the stain wasn't fabric deep. It was institutional. The first formal request from federal regulators arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. It wasn't dramatic. No agents at the door. No flashing lights. Just a letter. Request for documentation related to governance disclosures and related party transactions referenced in offering materials. I was seated in the Foundation's conference room when legal counsel read it aloud. The word inquiry sounded almost polite. An inquiry doesn't mean guilt. It means someone powerful is paying attention. Richard sat across from me. Expression controlled? He had perfected that look over years of negotiations, measured, unbothered. Above panic. This is procedural, he said evenly. Because of the IPO visibility, the attorney didn't nod. They're asking for expanded documentation beyond the Foundation, she replied, including overlapping advisory entities. Silence settled over the table. It wasn't just about consulting fees anymore. It was about structure, disclosure, intent. By lunchtime, our public relations firm had drafted holding statements. Words like cooperative and committed to transparency appeared repeatedly, Investors began calling. Some were supportive. Others were cautious. A few were quiet in ways that felt louder than criticism. That afternoon, the Dallas Business Chronicle published the headline we had all been bracing for. Charitable governance questions surface as Cole Capital prepares IPO. It wasn't accusatory. It didn't need to be. The implication was enough. Richard found me in my office shortly after the article went live. "You spoke to someone," he said. "I didn't. You positioned this." I recommended transparency. His voice sharpened. "You've handed regulators a narrative. They asked questions. We're answering them." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do you understand what this does to valuation? I understand what undisclosed conflicts do to trust." He stared at me like I was suddenly speaking a different language. "You're choosing them over us," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "I'm choosing not to lie." That evening, I met with an attorney of my own. I hadn't planned to. I hadn't wanted to. But when the Foundation's counsel explained that executive leadership could face personal liability if material omissions were proven, something shifted inside me. Silence in previous years could be interpreted as complicity. That realization settled heavily in my chest. "You need independent representation," the attorney told me. "If this escalates, you cannot rely on joint counsel." Joint. There was nothing joint about this anymore. When I returned home, Richard was in the study with the door half closed. I could hear fragments of his conversation with his legal team. Exposure. Containment. Voluntary disclosure. After he hung up, he found me in the kitchen. "They're expanding the scope," he said. "To what?" "They're reviewing transaction timing around capital restructuring." "Capital restructuring." His words were precise. "Sanitized?" "Did you disclose every related entity in the IPO draft?" I asked. His silence answered me. The next morning, the board convened again. Legal counsel outlined potential next steps. Because the Foundation had been referenced in promotional materials tied to the IPO, any governance breach could be interpreted as material misrepresentation. If regulators determine intentional omission, counsel said carefully, that shifts this from compliance review to enforcement risk. Enforcement. I watched Richard's composure strain for the first time. Later that day, an emergency vote was called. Richard was asked to step out of the room. He didn't argue. That worried me more than anger would have. When he returned, Thomas delivered the decision. "Pending outcome of the inquiry, the board is requesting that you take a temporary leave from active leadership of the Foundation." The words were formal. The meaning was simple. He was being sidelined. His jaw tightened. "This is premature." "It's protective," Thomas replied. "Protective of the institution, not of him." That night, the house felt unfamiliar. Richard stood near the staircase, hands in his pockets. "If this reaches enforcement level," he said quietly, "it won't just be my name in filings." I understood the implication. Shared leadership, shared signatures, shared risk. Then the truth matters even more. I answered. He looked at me differently then. Not with anger, not with superiority, with calculation. "I moved some personal assets into a separate trust months ago," he said. "In case of volatility." "Volatility. That's leverage." I said. "That's protection." "For whom?" He didn't respond. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't just about consulting payments. It wasn't even just about the IPO. It was about how far he had been willing to structure reality to protect perception, and how long I had been willing to look away. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. "Regulators have formally requested expanded documentation. This is no longer preliminary." I read it twice. The champagne humiliation felt distant now. Small. The stain had spread far beyond fabric. And it was still spreading. The word enforcement appeared in the second letter. Not inquiry. Not review. Enforcement consideration pending document analysis. I was sitting beside the Foundation's legal counsel when she underlined the phrase with her pen. No one in the room reacted outwardly, but the temperature seemed to drop. An enforcement action meant regulators believed there was enough to question intent. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "This is still procedural," he said. But his voice had lost its ease. Outside the conference room, phones were ringing constantly. Donors wanted reassurance. Investors wanted projections. Reporters wanted comment. The public relations team recommended careful language. Cooperation. Integrity. Commitment to transparency. Transparency. It had become both shield and blade. By noon, the second blow landed. The Dallas Business Chronicle updated their original story. This time, the headline included the phrase, "Federal Review Expands Scope." Within an hour, financial blogs picked it up. Investor calls intensified. "Who's speaking to the press?" Richard demanded in the executive suite. "No one," Thomas replied. "We announced the audit publicly. The rest is regulatory process." Richard's eyes shifted to me briefly. Suspicion. "You've positioned yourself as the whistleblower," he said later. "Once we were alone, I positioned the Foundation for accountability. You knew regulators would interpret that as instability. I knew silence would look worse." His composure fractured then. "You've destabilized the IPO," he snapped. "Valuation models are built on confidence, and confidence built on incomplete disclosure collapses anyway," I replied. He paced once across the study floor. "You don't understand how capital markets operate. I understand how trust operates." That night, I met my attorney again. "If enforcement proceeds," she explained, "regulators will examine executive knowledge and timing of disclosures. If you were aware of related party conflicts and failed to act, you could face exposure." "I acted," I said quietly. "You acted recently," she corrected gently. The weight of that distinction settled heavily. For years, I had trusted him. Trusted that strategy justified opacity. Trusted that timing explained silence. Trust was not a defense. The next morning, the board convened without Richard for the first half of the session. Thomas addressed the group directly. "Our obligation is to the Foundation's mission, not to any individual executive." No one disagreed. A vote was called. Temporary leave was no longer sufficient. "Pending resolution of federal review," Thomas announced when Richard re-entered the room. "The board is requesting your immediate resignation from active leadership roles." The word resignation hung in the air like something fragile. Richard didn't speak at first. His identity was fused with control, boardrooms, valuations, media profiles describing him as disciplined and visionary. Now the institution he built was asking him to step aside. "This is a mistake," he said finally. "It's protective governance," Thomas replied. "For the Foundation, for donors, for investors, not for him." The resignation was framed as voluntary. It wasn't. When the official statement went out that afternoon, media outlets moved quickly. "Foundation announces leadership transition amid federal review. Coal Capital delays IPO timeline." The phrase "delays IPO" was enough to unsettle markets. Investors began pausing commitments. Analysts questioned governance frameworks. Layer by layer, the structure shifted. That evening, the house felt cavernous. Richard stood in the living room staring at nothing. "They're expanding the scope to examine intent," he said quietly. "I know. If they interpret structuring as concealment." He didn't finish. I saw something in him I had never seen before. Not arrogance. Not anger. Fear. "Will you testify if asked?" he said finally. "I will tell the truth." The answer was simple. It felt like a line drawn in permanent ink. He looked at me for a long moment. "You could have handled this differently," he said. Perhaps. I could have kept the conversation private. I could have shielded him. I could have prioritized image over inquiry. But I remembered the champagne running down my dress. The smile. The certainty that humiliation would keep me quiet. "No," I said softly. I couldn't. Later that night, as I lay awake, My phone vibrated again. IPO officially postponed pending regulatory clarity. It was brief. Clinical, years of preparation undone in a single sentence. The man who built his empire on perception was now facing something perception couldn't fix. And for the first time since the Gala, I understood fully, this was no longer about revenge. It was about consequence. The final audit report was delivered on a quiet Thursday morning. No cameras. No headlines yet. Just a bound document placed in front of the board with clinical precision. Pattern of structured non-disclosure. Related party transactions insufficiently disclosed to full governing body. Overlap between charitable allocations and advisory entities tied to executive family members. It wasn't a mistake. It was a system. I watched Richard as the lead auditor summarized the findings. His face remained composed. But something behind his eyes had shifted. He no longer looked like a CEO managing fallout. He looked like a man calculating damage. Legal counsel spoke next. Given the IPO disclosures referencing executive integrity and governance standards, regulators may interpret omissions as material misrepresentation. Material. The word had followed us for weeks. Now it had weight. Richard cleared his throat. There was no intent to conceal. Timing decisions were made strategically. Intent will be assessed externally. Counsel replied evenly. Thomas folded his hands on the table. Our responsibility is to the foundation and its donors. Richard leaned forward. And I am the foundation's founder. You are, Thomas agreed. And that is why this is difficult. Difficult. That was a gentler word than consequences. Richard requested a moment to address the board privately. He spoke about growth, about liquidity management, about protecting the organization during expansion. He referenced market volatility, capital restructuring, long-term strategy. He never once used the word disclose. He never once said I'm sorry. When he finished, the room felt drained. Thomas called for a vote. The decision was nearly unanimous. Formal request for resignation from all leadership positions within the foundation. Effective immediately. No applause. No raised voices. Just the quiet sound of something ending. Richard's hands remained still on the table. He nodded once. I'll issue a statement, he said. That afternoon, the press release went live. Richard Cole resigns from Veterans Renewal Foundation amid ongoing federal review. Foundation commits to governance reform and full cooperation. By evening, financial outlets connected the dots. Cole Capital delays IPO indefinitely. Investors withdraw pending regulatory clarity. Valuation estimates revised downward. Layer by layer. The structure unraveled. Not in flames. In documentation. That night, the house felt different. Boxes sat near the staircase. A suitcase lay open on the bed in the guest room. Richard moved quietly, methodically. No anger now. No lectures about market mechanics. Sign a joint statement, he said at last. Standing in the doorway of my office. Clarify that this was governance oversight, not intentional misconduct. It will ease pressure. Ease pressure. For whom? I asked. For both of us. There it was again. The implication that our futures were fused. If the statement isn't fully accurate, I won't sign it, I said. He stepped further into the room. You could frame this as misunderstanding. Marital disagreement that escalated. You threw champagne on me in front of 300 guests, I said quietly. That wasn't a misunderstanding. His jaw tightened. You're still thinking about that. I'm thinking about what it revealed. He exhaled sharply. You chose donors over your husband. No, I said. I chose truth over silence. He studied me for a long moment. I built everything we had, he said. And you risked it. Silence filled the space between us. He picked up the suitcase handle. You could have handled this differently. The words were almost tired now. I looked at him. Not with anger, but with clarity. I already did, I said. He left without slamming the door. No dramatic exit. Just the quiet click of something closing. The next morning, news channels replayed footage from the Gala. The champagne moment. My toast. The announcement of the audit. Commentators called it a case study in nonprofit governance failure. Some called it betrayal. Others called it accountability. I didn't watch long. At the foundation, I was asked to step into interim leadership while the board restructured oversight committees. Independent compliance officers were brought in. Policies were rewritten. My name appeared in articles not as scandal, as reform. Richard's private equity partners issued cautious statements distancing operational control from him. The empire he built on perception had been dismantled by documentation. He didn't lose everything at once. He lost it layer by layer. That evening, alone in the now too large house, I walked past the dining room where we once hosted donors, past the staircase where he had stood warning me about federal exposure. I no longer felt the urge to win. The system had handled that. And for the first time since the champagne hit my skin, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, relief. 2 months after Richard's resignation, I sat at the head of the same conference table where his nameplate used to rest. The chair felt different than I expected. Not heavier. Lighter. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the foundation office, illuminating stacks of printed policy drafts in front of me. Independent compliance guidelines. Conflict of interest disclosure reforms. Quarterly reporting commitments. No one rushed when I entered anymore. No one waited for a single commanding voice to set the tone. We began meetings on time. We documented everything. We moved forward with full transparency, I said, looking around the table. No exceptions. There were nods. Not out of obligation. Out of agreement. Margaret Holloway attended that meeting as well. She listened quietly as our new independent oversight chair outlined procedures for public reporting and third-party financial reviews. When the presentation ended, she spoke softly. Trust doesn't return because we ask for it, she said. It returns because we earn it. I held her gaze and nodded. Trust had become something I understood differently now. Later that afternoon, I stood at the podium again, this time in a smaller donor update session. Not a gala. There were no chandeliers. No orchestras. Just a modest room filled with people who wanted reassurance. We made mistakes in governance, I said plainly. And we are correcting them. Publicly. No one gasped. No one whispered. They listened. After the meeting, several donors approached to express continued support. Not because everything was perfect, because it was honest. That evening, I drove past the mansion one last time. Richard had filed for divorce formally the previous week. The process was clinical, structured, predictable. The prenuptial agreement limited certain financial claims, but I retained my personal investments and my position within the foundation. My attorney had been clear, steady, protective. I moved into a smaller home across town. White walls, simple furniture, no echoing hallways. The first night there, I unpacked my own boxes. No one adjusted my necklace before I spoke. No one reminded me to smile for investors. Silence in that house didn't feel oppressive. It felt clean. The media cycle moved quickly. What had once been labeled a corporate scandal shifted into commentary about nonprofit reform and executive accountability. Articles began referencing the foundation's restructuring as a model for governance correction. Richard's name still appeared in headlines occasionally, often attached to phrases like delayed IPO and federal review. Mine appeared in a different context. Leadership transition. Transparency initiative. Reform. I didn't celebrate that contrast. I respected it. One afternoon, I ran into Richard briefly at a legal office to finalize paperwork. He looked thinner, quieter. No arrogance, no performance, just fatigue. We signed the documents in silence. At the door, he paused. You didn't have to take it that far, he said. I studied his face carefully. The champagne incident felt distant now. The humiliation, the smile, the belief that I would bow my head to protect his reputation. What stayed with me wasn't the splash of wine. It was the moment I chose not to swallow the truth. I didn't take it anywhere. I replied calmly. I stopped holding it back. He didn't argue. He left. That night, alone in my new living room, I poured myself a glass of water and sat quietly. Revenge had never been about shouting. It had never been about humiliation returned. It was about refusing to protect someone who was harming both the mission and my dignity. Loyalty without accountability becomes self-betrayal. Silence can look like grace, but sometimes silence is surrender. I thought about that ballroom again. The cold champagne against my skin. The way the crowd froze. The way he smiled as if humiliation would secure obedience. He believed public shame would shrink me. Instead, it clarified me. Power isn't dominance. It isn't reputation. It isn't the loudest voice in the room. Power is knowing when to stop protecting what is wrong. If you've ever been told to stay quiet to preserve someone else's image, if you've ever been made to feel dramatic for asking questions about money, integrity, or respect, I hope you understand something I learned the hard way. Dignity is not negotiable, and truth does not require permission. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced betrayal wrapped in charm or manipulation disguised as strategy, share your thoughts below. I read every comment, and this community grows stronger when we speak openly. Stay with this channel if you believe justice can be quiet and still powerful. Subscribe so we can continue telling stories about accountability, resilience, and the moments when the tables turn. Because sometimes the most important toast you ever give isn't about celebration. It's about drawing a line. He thought a glass of champagne would make me smaller. It only revealed how strong I already was.